let me say again, in terms of introduction, that Dr. Bradley Nassif is perhaps the foremost Orthodox theologian who is really involved in teaching and interacting with evangelical theologians and evangelical theology, which is something that we truly appreciate. And actually, lately there are, I would say, several books that came from Orthodox theologians, which, you know, are more ecumenical. And hopefully we'll be able to interact with all of them. So I mentioned Khaled Anatoliou's book, Deification Through the Cross, which is a very interesting book. Again, Eve Tibbs, who may be with us from Fuller Theological Seminary, who is also writing a book on Eastern Orthodoxy for mostly an evangelical audience. And of course, the book that it's the book that we'll discuss today is the Evangelical Theology of the Orthodox Church. So, Dr. Nassif, it's a great joy and pleasure and honor to have you with us. And I'll give you the time now to do a presentation so we can have our questions. And after a presentation of about 25 minutes, we'll have time for Q&A and time to interact. So the floor is yours, and we thank you.
Thank you. It's a great privilege for me to be with you here, especially on this important platform, because it's very rare that you have a whole group of evangelicals committed to understanding Orthodox Christianity. And so your work is, to me, one of the few leading lights on this important dialogue. So I commend you very highly for the work that you've done and are doing. I can't speak highly enough of it. And I believe you made reference to earlier to the LOI website, the Lausanne Orthodox Initiative, loimission.net, is where you can also find an Orthodox and evangelical appraisal of my book there as well from both points of view. So basically, I think what I want to do is to describe the basic content of the book, and then I was asked to focus on Orthodox renewal, and so that's what I would like to do, is to give a sort of a brief theological and practical presentation on how to go about it and why it can be done within an Orthodox setting, and not only can be done, but really needs to be done. So the title of my book, as was said, it was The Evangelical Theology of the Orthodox Church. And I need to thank Father Andrew Louth, who wrote the foreword to the book, and then the endorsements on the back by the very Reverend John McGuckin, professor at Oxford University, the late Billy Abraham, who was the director of the Wesleyan House of Studies at Baylor University, and Father Ted Stylianopoulos, professor of New Testament emeritus at Holy Cross Greek Orthodox Seminary. So I'm indebted to their support for this book, and I think the fact that those people have been willing to support it should go a long way to authenticate the validity and the importance and the urgency of our relationships for the purpose of Christ in the world. So in part one, just to kind of give you an idea of the basic structure of the book, in part, it has two parts. Part one focuses on the gospel, the evangelical character of the gospel in the Orthodox tradition. And part two then takes that understanding and brings it into dialogue with the evangelical tradition. So in part one, it's titled The Evangelical Theology of the Orthodox Church in Worship, Spirituality, and Doctrine. So this is a collection of essays that I have written over the years. It's really a culmination of a lifetime work that I have put into this book, written over a number of years and updated. And so I focus on how is the gospel presented? First, what is the gospel? And then how is it presented in Orthodox worship? How is it presented in spiritual life? And how is it presented in the church's doctrine? And I use the word evangelical there to simply mean gospel, not in the Protestant evangelical sense of the term, but in the more broad technical sense of the good news of the saving gospel of Christ. So those are the three areas I focus on. What is the gospel in worship, spirituality, and doctrine? And if those of you that don't have time to read the book but want to go straight to the heart of it, I would suggest that you read the introduction, what is the gospel, and then go straight to the conclusion of part 1, titled Conclusion, Nourishing the Gospel in Orthodox Parishes Today. And then in part 2, the one to read there is Evangelicalism Through Orthodox Eyes. And then the conclusion, Evangelicals in the Church's Great Tradition. So that's the shortcut for those of you that want to just don't have the time but still want to get to the fruit of the book. So that's how I approach it. The gospel as it's understood in the Orthodox tradition, and then how it relates to evangelicalism. And what I do, especially in the chapter on part 2, Orthodoxy and Evangelicalism in Dialogue, the section titled Evangelicalism Through Orthodox Eyes, is an attempt to take the definition. Here I'm talking about Protestant evangelicalism now with a different kind of twist on the word evangelical. And I deal with the British historian David Bebbington's definition for four qualifications of an evangelical there. And I must say that when we had the talk at Lausanne, that Danuț Monasterianu, the evangelical Anglican, really had some very good and constructive revisions of Bebbington's 4 points, which I would think are very worthwhile. All right, so that's the basic idea of what the book is about. And now, how does that book relate to the question of the gospel in the Orthodox Church? How can we, in a very practical way, how can we take that information, that knowledge, and maximize it for the conversion of others, for the renewal of the Orthodox tradition, and so that's what the focus is on here. Now, there's also, you can go the other way with the evangelical benefits as well, but I want to focus on the church itself. So the first thing I think I would suggest, and here I'm going off of evangelical identity number 3 in Bebbington's description of evangelicalism, that is, conversionism, I have committed my life to Christ and consider myself to be converted. Here, my basic point is that Orthodoxy has all the resources it needs for renewal within the tradition itself. And for people that are in the church and want to see renewal, as well as for evangelicals who do not belong to the Orthodox Church, but want to see renewal in the church, here's my suggestions for making that happen. The first thing I would do is I would stress Orthodox conversion theology. Use the language and liturgy and theology of the church to bring about the renewal that we all want to see happen. So the best place to begin this, in my opinion, is to stress the sacramental rites of baptism. That's really the starting point. The Orthodox baptismal liturgy is an evangelical or gospel sacrament of the church's symbolic and ritual proclamation of Christ. And that summons us and our children to costly faith and discipleship. And if we look at that, and I just have a few excerpts here, if you go to the baptismal service, this is what the priest says. He directly to either the adult or the child, most often it's the child, because in standard Orthodox culture, most people come to the church within it. And so, but still, the theologies we want to look at here. The priest says, do you renounce Satan and all his angels and all his works and all his service and all his pride? The answer, I do. Priest, have you renounced Satan? I have. Priest, breathe and spit upon him. Priest, do you unite yourself to Christ? Now listen to this, there you have it. Do you unite yourself to Christ? I do unite myself to Christ. Have you, the second time, have you united yourself to Christ? I have united myself to Christ. Third time, do you believe in him? I believe in him as King and as God. And then again, have you united yourself unto Christ? I have. Bow down before him. And then they bow down before the Holy Trinity and confess the faith of the church. Now, this is crucial because basically what you just heard is the heart of Protestant evangelical evangelism. We're asking people, evangelicals are asking people, whether Orthodox or non-Orthodox, have you committed yourself to Christ? Have you given yourself to Christ? That should be an easy answer for the Orthodox, but as you probably know from experience, a lot of Orthodox sort of say, what do you mean? I'm Orthodox. Why are you asking me that? Well, I'll get to that in a minute. What we have here then is the problem, or the challenge, I should say, of applying baptismal theology to the conversion of adults, Orthodox adults. How do we do that? What is there in the church's own tradition that can help us to bring people to faith in Christ? Here, again, you build on the baptismal texts of the church, but then you also turn to other internal resources in the Orthodox Church. And as you can tell, what I'm doing here in this talk is I'm suggesting to you that the best resources to use in bringing out renewal, whether you are an evangelical trying to talk to an Orthodox, or you are an Orthodox born and raised, and you love the church and you love the theology and you're committed to everything in the Orthodox Church, you have the responsibility as well of leading your people into a living relationship with Christ and not simply a formal one. So I'm suggesting that we use the internal resources of the church's own theology. That's the best thing you can possibly do. You don't need to go to Martin Luther. You don't need to go to the Reformers, but they do have good things to say, of course. But you have it all right there. The treasures are there. You see, my thought is that we live in a golden ghetto. The Orthodox have all these rich resources, and yet we live as though we're just paupers. So my approach is to tap into that priceless gold and use it for the glory of God. So you go to the baptismal service and you point out that we need a living relationship with Christ. It's not enough simply to go to church every day, or every week, and to go through all the formalities. There has to come a time of real commitment to Jesus Christ. That's what you did when you were baptized as a baby. So how do you feel about it now? So just yesterday, in fact, at my own church, Holy Transfiguration in Warrenville, Antiochian Church, I was talking to our adults in our adult Sunday school class, and the point was exactly this: how do you raise children, Orthodox children in the church? And one of the things I told them is what I'm telling you now, is that you mustn't assume that just because a child goes to church, that they know God. They might have grown up in the church, but don't have a living relationship with Christ. And so there's the need to help them to come into a saving relationship with Christ. Stress the ABCs. This isn't rocket science. It's just the basics of the gospel. And so that will be done in a number of different ways. But let me move now to the after the post-baptismal experience. After the baptismal experience, other things you can rely upon are the church's own mystical writers to help bring about Orthodox renewal. Here, two people are especially helpful: Saint Macarius of Egypt, who lived from 300 to 390, a great desert father, and then Saint Simeon, the new theologian, a Byzantine theologian and mystic and monk, who lived from 949 to 1022. Both of these writers acknowledge the importance of the sacrament of baptism, but they acknowledge that any water baptism that is not accompanied in adulthood by a conscious experience of God in the heart cannot save. Macarius and Simeon's witness successfully navigates this tension between the institution of the church, if I can use that term, and the spirit of the church in this. Church members, they called church members to the gospel message of conversion for those Orthodox who have undergone the formality of baptism, but live in an experiential denial of its life-giving power. The remedy they offer is simply that the Orthodox people need to repent and follow Jesus as Lord of their lives. And this comes about when a person makes the church's faith their own. So back to the raising of children, especially, adults, Orthodox adults must not assume that just because they've been baptized and grow up in the church that these children know God. They're like any other child. There has to come a time in their faith where they make the church's faith their own. Now that can come about gradually, where they grow up in the church, but they still have to be asked, are you following Christ? Are you a disciple of Jesus? What does that mean to be a disciple? What does it mean to take up the cross? So that's very crucial. And then for the adults, it may, and for other people, it may be a very sudden conversion. Saint Simeon, the new theologian, especially if you read his hymns, you see the mystical experience that he had when he encountered Christ as an adult, a baptized adult. And boy, did he give the church a hard time, because his point was, you can go to, and he was talking to the monks, you can go to the orthro service every morning, you can say your prayers, you can do all the liturgy that you want, and still not know God. In other words, you can be religious but lost. And I think this is very important for the Orthodox to keep in mind, that it is possible for an Orthodox Christian, in fact, I believe that probably many of us, like myself, grew up religious but lost. My own story is certainly testimony to that. I was ordained when I was 16 in Wichita, Kansas, at St. Mary's Antiochian Orthodox Church. My grandparents came from Lebanon. I was born here, but in those days they needed priests, so I was going to be ordained. The Archbishop, the Patriarch of Antioch, gave permission for me to be ordained as a subdeacon. I was going to be a priest, and I was basically a good person, morally good, and went to church all the time, but I still didn't know the Lord until I was 17 years old, and I came into a life-giving relationship with Christ. It was an amazing and life-changing experience. So all of that is, the resources for renewal are within our church. And so that's the very important thing. Now, the last few things I would like to say about this is the actual doing of it. When we preach the gospel in the Orthodox tradition, there are all kinds of ways in which to bring about this conversion or this dedication, this commitment to Christ and discipleship. You can do it, the priest can do it in the confessional. He can do it when he makes hospital visitations, Bible studies, personal conversations, or over a cup of coffee with a parishioner. If they just open their minds and eyes to the opportunities that lie before them, they can make the gospel clear and central to the parishioners that they deal with and the life of the church. So the first thing, after we connect all this and we see, and there's no sequence here, right? Just keep these ideas in mind and use them however the circumstance requires. But what we want to do, the big thing, is to make the gospel clear and central and compelling in every life-giving action of the church. What I've done in part one of my book is to simply show that there is a gospel ethos that is embedded in the entire structure of the church's tradition, and that many clergy and laity need to be awakened to the core message of salvation that is there in the liturgy, the divine liturgy on Sunday, as well as the dogmatic and spiritual life of the church. So This is important, is that as we preach the gospel, many of our sermons are not very good in terms of, making the gospel clear. What often we do is we hear try harder messages from the pulpit. Just try harder, fast more, go to church more often, give more, do, try harder. Well, yes, there is that part of the gospel. The biblical gospel, though, is sometimes replaced with liturgical legalism, though, as if simply trying harder and going to church more often will cure the spiritual disease that we have. So we should really ask ourselves, are our people evangelized or simply sacramentalized? Big difference. You can be religious but lost. And so this is the importance of keeping the main thing. The main thing. What is the main thing? The gospel, the saving gospel of Christ. And what is the gospel? I described what that is in part one, or the introduction, what is the gospel? And at the end of part one, where I do the conclusion, you can see what the components of the gospel are. That doesn't mean we go around preaching every day and everything's all about that. You can find the gospel in all the feast days of the church. The great 12 feasts, the gospel is presented. So find it out. Another thing that can be done is to stress that salvation is the gift of God. That emphasis is often eclipsed in the church when its leaders, both clergy and laity alike, present the Christian life primarily as an obligation instead of a gift. Salvation is presented in moral categories, as if human effort can earn entrance into heaven by fulfilling a host of religious obligations. Too often there is an insufficient stress on the heart of Christianity as being the gift of God's own Son. Now, this is not to say that the gospel doesn't have a task attached to it. It certainly does. There is this synergy, the cooperation of us with God, of both blessings and demands of the gospel. But more fruit will come to parishes that stress the gospel first and foremost as the gift of God, not obligation. So it's an accent that I'm talking about, an emphasis. Finally, we need to invite people to take up the cross and follow him. It's a message that is abundantly present in Orthodox Christianity, especially its monastic teachers. Yet again, the gold that lies within the church's tradition needs to be mined. The nature of the gospel as a gift requires that that gift be received. There's a response. Our people need to be asked from time to time, where do they stand in relation to Jesus Christ? Although the church doesn't have altar calls, the invitation to examine one's personal commitment to Christ can happen, as I said earlier, in preaching, confession, counseling, Bible studies, home and hospital visits, feasts and fasts of the liturgical year, or simply over a dinner or cup of coffee. Regardless of when or how it happens, internal evangelism is urgently needed today among lapsed Orthodox who no longer go to church, or those Orthodox in the pew who are simply nominal and need to renew their baptismal vows. So internal evangelism is absolutely crucial. And a priest who especially has this opportunity can really make a difference if he gets this as part of his priestly ministry. The Eucharist also, I would say, is a sacramental witness to the worshiping community about the centrality of the gospel. Why is that? As St. Paul says in 1 Corinthians, as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you do what? You proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. So the Eucharist itself is a proclamation of the gospel. It's the central proclamation in the church's whole life. So you see, there's a great many opportunities that we have there, and unfortunately, we have buried it in all of the things that we do, and the gospel is not clear to people. So if I would summarize the whole thing, I would say that the church, when the church weakens its focus on the gospel, the parish becomes weak. But when the church strengthens its focus on the gospel, the parish can become holy fire. And it's my prayer that that's exactly what will happen in our parishes. And those of you that are listening to this, perhaps you can be a carrier of the good news in the Orthodox tradition. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Nassif. I think for us evangelicals, most of the things that you have said, they are really refreshing, because these are things which are very dear in our hearts. But of course, and you will allow me a very short response, as
Sure.
our sisters and brothers, you are thinking about questions, and we'll talk about how you can raise questions. So start thinking about questions. So a response that let me say it like this. I still remember when I was a student at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary many years ago, reading for the first time the book by Zizoulas, Being as Communion. And at the beginning, I was really impressed. And, about, its ecclesiology. Of course, I didn't pick up his episcopocentric theology so much, because I was really fascinated about all the other aspects there. But it was really intriguing, emphasizing the community of the faithful around the Eucharist and all of that. But then, and that will bring me to my response and question, I said, okay, because I'm grown, I grew up in Greece. So, I grew up as a Protestant, but I had any direct knowledge of Eastern Orthodoxy, but still it was all over the place. It was around me. So then I started thinking, okay, where exactly that thing exists? What that ecclesiology that he describes in that book so perfectly. Where are the places where actually that takes place? And a concern that one may raise is, okay, what you say sounds really great, but and of course you already mentioned that many times, the gospel is buried and all of that, but a concern is, okay, where in real life that actually happens. Unfortunately, in our experience, I'll speak about Greece, not in so many parishes that we know. So for me, what I found really refreshing from your own approach, it was this emphasis and even telling your testimony and focusing that there was, a time that it may be a dramatic moment or it can be a process, but there is a time that there is a conscious conversion, turning towards Jesus and all of that. So I found that really refreshing, and we welcomed that. So, as you know, in most places where Orthodox is a majority religion, it's part of your national heritage, national identity. So you don't really think about those things. You just, you happen to be, you are born into your religion. So in many, I would say that even some Greek Orthodox theologians raise this concern about the sacramentalism. You have mentioned that. I need to be honest with you, reading your book at times, I felt that there is so much emphasis on the sacraments, or the liturgy there, and not so much emphasis on that all this thing makes sense when there is faith and there is a conscious participation to that. So there is this theology of the elevator. I don't know if you have heard this expression. Some Greek Orthodox theologians use it, that it's almost an automatic thing, that you take the Eucharist, you don't understand most of the things that take place, but as long as you are in the elevator, you push the right button, it will take you wherever you're supposed to go. But so there is that atmosphere as well. So let me conclude. I was ready to discuss some other parts of your book, which I'm not, since you didn't touch them, there's no point of raising them, and hopefully I'll try to write a review emphasizing. I found most fascinating, to be honest with you, the last pages of your book. And I think for me that is really ecclesiology. Is, I mean, you talk about history, but primarily you mean ecclesiology, and that I think is a key issue that we need to resolve, and perhaps is the number one, the key issue that separates us, the way we understand the church and what it means to be the church and who is the church. But I'll leave that aside, and let me raise my, a concern that for most Protestants will, I think, and perhaps I anticipate some of the questions, that you locate conversion, and even in other parts of your book, justification, in the rite of baptism. And of course, we all know that, in the Orthodox tradition is predominantly infant baptism. So you mentioned in other context in the book that, okay, it's something that mystikos, in a mysterious, in a mystical way, you receive this grace. And of course, it's a free gift of grace, because nobody's asking you whether you want to be baptized or not. They just freely give you that. I remember reading Zmeman and his chapter on baptism, and I said, okay, in a way that is totally free grace, because nobody asks you, and they give you this. But then the question is what, and here is my concern, and you can respond to that. What actually activates that grace that you receive in baptism? Now, you mentioned in your presentation, it's a conscious faith and response to that. And I totally welcome that. But in your book, in several places, definitely in the treatment of Mark the monk, is obedience. I just read, and of course, let me read this part which I was able to locate. It's in page 123, where you quote saying 85, where it says, each person baptized in Orthodox manner has mystikos, received the fullness of grace, but each person is fully assured, pleurophorit of grace afterwards, to the extent that he keeps the commandments. So I wonder, I totally agree that, we espouse and celebrate this emphasis that Orthodox are not Catholics, they're not talking about meritorious good works and all of that. But I wonder, isn't that a way that you bring good works from the back door? So salvation eventually is to the extent that you keep the commandments, because that is what activates the grace that you receive mystically in the baptism. So that is my question, and you can respond to that if you may. And then, of course, please, we'll receive more questions, later.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Those are all very good observations, and I'm grateful that we can have a frank and honest discussion about these things. To address your last point about grace and works, on page 120, Mark's saying number 23, I think, is important to balance it out. He says, every good work that we do through our own nature causes us to abstain from its opposing evil. And this is the next sentence is the important one. But without grace, it cannot increase our holiness. So the way I understand Mark and the whole ascetic tradition of the church is that our good works are motivated by grace. So when Mark emphasizes the need for obedience and puts the accent there, that obedience is motivated and driven by and empowered by a previous grace. So we cannot boast. None of us can boast of our own good works. And St. Mark makes that very clear in his work. In fact, the title of it, that no one, that we are not justified by works, in the title of his treatise there. It's titled the Gospel According to St. Mark, the Monk, chapter there. So I would say that. Now, is that clear in the church? No, it's probably not. I think this is a good pastoral point you make, because we need to emphasize the priority of grace. And I go back to the earlier point I made about the need for stressing salvation as a gift more than simply an obligation. That's what the Bible does. You know, John 3:16, God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son. So I think that's really a matter of of emphasis and a recognition of the priority of grace. To your other question, or rather observation, that you read Ecclesiological, and you have this beautiful theology, and you ask, where is it? Where is this beautiful church you describe? Well, I think that's a fair question and a very good one. And I think we Orthodox have to be honest and say that there is a glaring contradiction between our principles and our practice. We are not living up to the beautiful church and the beautiful theology that Ecclesiological and others have created. And I think that to defend ourselves and to say, oh, well, we're the true church and everybody else is wrong, it really doesn't answer the problem that we're just not living up to our own faith. There's a conflict between principles and practice. So, pardon me. I think the sooner we admit that, the sooner we'll get there. Now, here in America, we had a movement back in 1987. Father Peter Gilchrist, there was a group of evangelicals that came into the Antiochian Archdiocese, in which about 1,700 of them, and the number of their churches were accepted into the church. And when they came in, they brought in quite a renewal in the 1980s, 1990s, and then it sort of cooled off after that. But I can say that the church that I belong to, All Holy Transfiguration Antiochian Orthodox Church in Warrenville, Illinois, we're a very small parish, only about 50 people. But our church really, I give credit to the priest, Father Wilbur Ellsworth, but also the people who themselves are true believers. I think this is one of the best churches that we have, where the gospel is central. And there are other Orthodox churches, but a lot of time in America, in both the Antiochian and the Greek, or I should say Antiochian Greek and OCA, that you do have pockets of liveliness there. It doesn't characterize the whole thing, though, and it wouldn't be fair to say that. But I credit this in part to the renewal that was brought in from Father Peter Gilchrist back in the 1980s. So we have that. And a lot of the people that come into the church that have enlivened the church in an evangelical way have themselves come from evangelical backgrounds, and they already have this life-giving experience and commitment to Christ. So I think that's
Thank you. Let me, sorry to interrupt you, but let me say that this is the time to raise your questions. And there are two ways. The most preferable one, in order to save time, it is if you want to write on the chat your question, but or in the Q&A button down in the screen, or if you want to speak up, then you push the raised hand, and we'll open your microphone. So we have one. I don't know if you can read it, Dr. Nassif. Some really good Orthodox people are eager to see the Orthodox hierarchy transferring the language that is used in the old services into modern Greek. The liturgical language used is described as wooden. Do you think that will ever happen? Oops, sorry.
I'm not in a position to answer that, because I'm not involved with the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese in Greece. But I do think that it's urgent and that it should happen. It's contrary to Orthodox mission theology, as well as just common sense. So I think the only way that can happen is if people talk, Orthodox people talk to their hierarchy and make it clear that this is the way the church has done it. And again, I go back to using the church's theology. Go back to the mission theology of how Cyril and Methodius, for example, in the medieval period, brought the gospel. What did they do? They translated the Bible, the Fathers, and the liturgy into the vernacular. That's always been the case. So the fact that we have, and this isn't just true in Greece, it's true in Russia, it's true in a lot of the old Orthodox countries where the liturgy is in a language that is largely unintelligible. To me, this is an absolute sin on the part of the church by keeping, this is another example of keeping the gospel obscured because it's not being intelligible, it's not being given in a common language that we speak.
And as we're waiting for more questions to come, you mentioned the Russian Orthodox Church, and that tempts me to ask you. I have read a very recent article that you have contributed. If you have any comment about this, because you know, as evangelicals, we have our own share of Christian nationalism, especially in the United States. So I'm not saying that this is only an Orthodox problem, but for us, it's very interesting that you have 2 or even 3 Orthodox churches, and you know there is this conflict there. Do you have any comment to make on the situation in Ukraine?
Well, my only concern there is, of course, for evangelicals, because I think the way the church is being handled, or I should say that the potential consequences of a takeover of Ukraine would be very difficult, just as it is now in Russia, where they have these laws that are being applied almost indiscriminately to non-Orthodox Christians, as if the Orthodox leaders or people or whoever makes these decisions, and whoever may, and the state can sometimes not make the proper distinction between an evangelical and, let's say, a Jehovah's Witness, that they're all lumped together in one great sea of undifferentiated darkness. So I'm hopeful. I'm not. It could be very, very difficult for evangelicals in that part of the world. I think that the church can help. The state can help the Orthodox Church, and that's a good thing, but should not have laws that are. People's hearts need to be changed from the inside through reason and through the freedom of choice, not political imposing of the Orthodox faith on people.
We have one more question that comes from Ukraine, actually, from Edward. Thank you for a great presentation. How would you answer to some evangelicals who think the Eastern Orthodox people believe in the gospel and the works, which works includes, in parentheses, baptism, liturgy, prayers to the saints, and so on? Is it faith and works, gospel and works? Tell us a little bit more about, and the reality is that for most of us who read theology in the West, you see a lot of Protestant response to Catholicism. Right. And by association, many times we transfer that to the Eastern Orthodox. And for me, I mean, we differ in many ways, but that is not the thing, in the sense that, you know, that you're saved by your good works. So if you can elaborate more, you have touched on that, but if you can elaborate.
I think you put it very well, because I think there is this transference of categories between the Protestant response to the medieval Catholicism and then transferring that over to the Orthodox. So I think that's the first thing which you have rightly pointed out. We have a different theological context. The second thing I would say is that the church, in its deepest theology, in its clearest presence, and in its theological tradition, doesn't teach that faith and work, that we're saved, that it's salvation by works, in the sense that you have these two operations, two different things. Rather, the church's understanding is that good works are the fruit of the gospel. If there's no good works, then there's no genuine faith. But the good works are the product of faith. It's the fruit and the tree. The good works are the fruit of the tree. Both belong together, but it's the tree that produces the fruit. And in my chapter on evangelicalism through Orthodox eyes, I think you can see this more. If you want more information on this, you can find it there. The Orthodox Lutheran dialogue here in North America, which I was a part of before it ceased a number of years ago, there's a book called Salvation in Christ, edited by John Meyendorff and another man. And there you can see very clearly that what I've just said is supported by other Orthodox theologians. The problem comes where it's not clear in the minds of the priests or the people. And so I think we need to be more Orthodox and more gospel, have a greater clarity of the gospel for this important thing to be known and emphasized.
Let me read one more question that comes from Albania. What is the Orthodox view of the consequences of the fall, of the sin of Adam and Eve's effect on the human race?
Well, I would say that the effects are, well, what it isn't. The church doesn't believe that people inherit guilt. We inherit the consequences of the fall, but not the guilt of Adam and Eve. So what are the consequences? Well, about everything else you can imagine that you hear about on the results of the fall. It affects our minds, our wills, our body. Everything about us is wayward and misdirected. Our wills are not properly aligned. We naturally go this way and that way, rather than as it once was aligned with God. So the will is adversely affected, the soul is darkened, the mind is darkened, and the body is now subject to corruption and death.
Thank you. We have one more question, which comes from North Macedonia this time. What would you expect at the very best outcome of an Orthodox evangelical interaction? I think that's a question that is very close to exactly what you do, and you have dedicated many years of your ministry and career in that. What would you consider would be the best outcome?
I would say the best outcome would be a mutual support of our common agreement on core aspects of the gospel, that we would proclaim a common gospel, that Jesus Christ is Lord, God, and Savior, that every person needs to, we need to bring that good news to the lost and dying of the world, that salvation is through Jesus Christ and his death and resurrection on the cross, and that new life begins and is sustained through life in the Holy Trinity and all that goes with it. Now, there's so much left out of what I've just said, the sacramental and the icons and all of that. But if we keep the gospel clear, I think both of those things can happen. Now, in terms of common preach, the other things that good positive outcomes would be a common witness, not only to the gospel, but also social action, where we might share a common commitment to, for example, abortion not being a good thing, being a sin. And so finding common social action. Back to evangelism, I'm hurrying my answer here, so I hope I'm not leaving too much out. But Billy Graham was a successful model, I think, of cooperative evangelism. And I know there are Orthodox that wouldn't agree with what I'm saying, and there are a lot of evangelicals that wouldn't either. But I think Billy Graham had it right. When he was in Moscow, for example, and other parts of Russia, he was blessed by the hierarchy, same in Romania. He preached the good news, but what did they do? He brought the people that converted back into the churches, and hopefully good Orthodox churches where they can be sustained. So I think there's the potential for cooperative evangelism in Billy Graham's style. but not everybody would agree with me, and that's okay if they don't.
From either camps, I should
Yeah.
say. We have, this is more like a comment, observation at the question again from Ukraine. Thank you. I think it is correct to make distinction between Orthodox theology from books and Orthodox practice on a popular level that might seem contradictory. And I think that, you made this point already and you would agree.
Yes.
Let me throw one last question, unless there is something else that the participants would like to raise. And again, reading your book, I haven't read every single page, but I read most of it. And the question I have is this: do you think that you are missing, and the it's you personally, you plural, missing something of importance, not including, not paying enough attention to the doctrine of justification?
Well, that's a good question. The fathers don't deal with that question the same way the reformers did.
Yeah.
And again, we're back to the theological framework. And but it's true. I mean, you don't have to look at the Reformation. It's there in Galatians and it's there in Romans, justification by faith. I think that the Orthodox need to deal more specifically with that. Yes.
Yeah.
And
if I may, that is something that always concerns me, because okay, the fathers haven't dealt with that, and Luther did, which is again all right. We learn from that. I mean, has he recovered something perhaps that was important, that had to be emphasized? And I still remember reading this little book by Callistos, where this very interesting book about how are we saved, which is a very short,
I've seen
book.
It.
And in that book, he makes this comment when he talks about justification, saying, all right, yeah, and that thing also exists. I'm just using my own words here. And he says that I realized that I checked my book about the Orthodox Church, which is like his big book presenting, that, and I haven't had not even one reference to justification. So I'm not saying that perhaps us evangelicals, perhaps we're making it a central doctrine that the church stands or falls on it. Okay, that may be one thing, but to go to the other, let's say, extreme, that it doesn't play any role, that is something that since we have you here and we have this discussion, I think it will be worthwhile to see, it's very easy to say it's a legal fiction, it's forensic, is whatever, but is there any input that perhaps brings in, and that anyway?
Well, yeah, I think it's important to go back to the theme of deification, because union with Christ, from the best I've been able to, and I've thought about this quite a bit, that union with Christ is the foundation of justification. That justification cannot occur until we are first in Christ through faith. And so I think that's the priority that the Orthodox, the fathers, would certainly give to it, is the relationship between deification as the prior theological reality. Now, in the Lutheran tradition, there's this Manumara, if I'm pronouncing that correct, tradition in Helsinki, Finland, that added a corrective to Luther's forensic elements of justification. And so even Lutherans today have recognized the importance of deification and participation in Christ as being closely related to the question of justification. So I think that's what I would do.
Thank you. I think we are like 2 minutes past 7, our time in Greece. And I don't see any other questions. I mean, people are sending their gratitude, and so do we. And we are really, thank you, Dr. Nassif, for your presentation and your kind spirit. And we pray that more theologians in the Orthodox Church will have your own spirit and attitude and burden for the proclamation of the gospel, and we would like to commend you for that, and hopefully we'll cooperate and have more discussions like that in the future. So we'd like to thank you so very much from the bottom of our hearts.